A few minutes. Perfect. I'm just going to wait maybe for another 30 seconds or so that people come in. You can hear the beeping of the snow plows in the background. Yeah, so I'm just going to start the introduction. So thank you very much for coming to our AA session, which would have been here outside in snowy Boston, but you didn't have to travel this year. I have the distinct honor to have on the session going first Jennifer Lau, then Christina Patterson, then David Baqaee, and I'm going to go last. Jen, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. This is joint work with Alireza Tahbaz-Salehi. Okay, so in the canonical New Keynesian model, the optimal policy is well known, which is to stabilize the aggregate price level. And why is this optimal? Well, price stability preserves both productive efficiency and hence implements the first best. So in the language of Blanchard and Gali, the divine coincidence holds, which means that price stability minimizes both inflation and the output gap. Now, the target is pretty straightforward in the canonical model because the aggregate price level is just the average price across all of these homogeneous firms. Now, in the real world, it's much more complex. There are multiple heterogeneous sectors that interact in a network of intermediate good trade. So how should the aggregate price index optimally depend on whether sectors are final goods or intermediate goods producers? So think of like the CPI versus the PPI, where sectors are positioned in the input-output network, differences in the relative price flexibility of sectors, as well as changes in the relative size of sectors. So for example, we know that within the last decade, services, in particular healthcare, has greatly increased in the US and other developed countries relative to manufacturing goods. So the question we answered in this paper is, how does this heterogeneity, in particular the multi-sector input-output structure of the economy, affect the optimal conduct of monetary policy? And our model essentially has two ingredients. One is it's going to be an input-output model along the lines of Long and Placer, Asimoglu et al., and all these other networks papers we now have in this literature. And so we're going to have an input-output network of intermediate good trade across these sectors. So sectors will be will have these heterogeneous sectors, and they're going to have sectoral productivity shocks. Those will be the only shocks in this model, and therefore the underlying flexible price economy in this, or flexible price equilibrium in this economy would be efficient. However, in this economy, we add some frictions, and in particular, the frictions we add are nominal rigidities in the form of an informational friction. So we're going to assume that managers must set their nominal prices before observing demand. And this informational friction is very much along the lines of other papers in this literature, such as Woodford 2003. Okay, so what are our results? So the first part of our paper shows that the divine coincidence type of result is non-generic. And that's basically saying that you cannot, when you have this multi-sector economy, you cannot implement the efficient allocations generically under sticky prices. So that's kind of like a negative result. We then turn to, well, what is the best one could do? So we turn to solving the optimal monetary policy. And the optimal monetary policy we show stabilizes an optimal price index with greater weights on the following factors. The two things that matter the most are how large the sectors are and how sticky the sectors are. And by large, what I mean is not large in terms of their consumption share. Basically how we measure largeness in these input-output models is really their Domar weights. And we're going to show that the Domar weights, or the sales share of GDP, is going to be really important for this optimal price index. So you want to put the greatest weights on large sectors and stickier sectors. Through a series of examples, we also show that all the other things equal, you also want to put greater weight on more upstream sectors, sectors with sticky customers, and sectors with more flexible suppliers. But in terms of quantitatively, we find that really the most important things are how large these sectors are and how sticky the sectors are. And then finally, we go to a quantitative illustration and we look at what are the welfare improvements from adopting the optimal policy. So we calibrate the model to the BEA US input-output tables and data on price stickiness at the sectoral level. And we show that moving from CPI stabilization to what we solve for as the optimal policy, you get a welfare gain of about 0.5 percentage point of quarterly consumption. Okay, finally, 20-minute presentation. I'm not going to talk much about the related literature, but I just want to highlight that the papers we're probably most closely connected to are papers in production networks and nominal rigidities, such as these papers I'm highlighting here, as well as some of the papers we're seeing today. Okay, so here's the environment. We're going to consider a static environment. Production is going to be organized in N sectors indexed by I, and we're going to have this intermediate good trade across these sectors, which is going to constitute our input-output network. Firms within any sector are going to be identical. So within a sector, we're going to have a continuum of firms indexed by K. These firms are going to produce these differentiated goods just so that they can be monopolistic competitors and set prices. And then finally, the managers of these firms are going to make their nominal pricing decision under incomplete information, and that's going to be our form of nominal rigidity. So let me get into more of the specifics. This is for firm K in sector I. This is their production function. So for most of our paper, we have a very general production function, but for today, let's say it's Cobb-Douglas. So we have a productivity shock ZI, labor LIK of firm K in sector I, alpha I is their labor share. And then these are their intermediate inputs. So this is the amount that firm K in sector I uses of the good from sector J. And so AIJ will be that input share in that firm. And hence you can think of the input output matrix in our economy as being just this matrix of these AIJs, of these input shares. The nominal profits of the firm are given by the following. So basically they'll get some revenue. We have a revenue tax here, which I'll explain why we have that. And then they have this is how much they pay to labor, as well as how much their expenditure on their inputs. And PJ is the price of the good in sector J. And then finally, as I said before, we want these to be price setters. So for that, we need some monopolistic competition. So we say for each sector at the sector level, there's going to be a perfectly competitive aggregator firm, which aggregates the goods of each of these firms within sector I with this elasticity of substitution theta I. And this output from this firm may either be used as consumption or as an intermediate good for other sectors in the economy. The household side is very boring. We just have preferences over consumption and labor. They have some consumption over these bundle over these different goods. And for now, just think of this as being Cobb-Douglas, where beta I are these consumption shares. And then finally, this is the budget set of the household. So they get some profits from the firms and a lump sum transfer from the government. Okay, in terms of the government, it's pretty simple. We just have a fiscal budget set. So the transfers have to be equal to the amount of taxes they collect from these firms. And because it's a static model, we simply say that monetary authority directly controls aggregate nominal demand. So they get to just choose this M, which is equal to nominal demand P times C. And then finally, we just have market clearing in all of the goods markets, as well as all of the labor markets. Okay, so now let me talk about how we model the nominal rigidity. So in the first half of the paper, we make this very general, but for this presentation, let me just go with our Gauss, one of our specifications, which is a nice Gaussian specification. So let's suppose that technology shocks, so technology, oops, there's a vector of technology shocks, Zi. We're going to assume these technology shocks are normal with mean 0 and some variance. And then these firms are going to get imperfect information about these technology shocks. In particular, they're going to have a Gaussian information set. So think of firm K and sector I getting a signal, or basically a vector of signals, one for each productivity shock in the economy. So you can think of basically omega ij of firm K is a signal of that this firm gets of the productivity shock in sector J with some idiosyncratic noise. So therefore, the aggregate state in our economy is not just going to be the fundamentals, which is the vector of sectoral productivities, but is also going to include this entire distribution of information sets in the economy. Okay, so how do we model the nominal rigidity? Our nominal rigidity is essentially that these firm managers must make their nominal pricing decisions under incomplete information. So all of these firms get a signal of these productivity shocks, and they need to set a price based on that information. And therefore, the nominal rigidity in our model is essentially just a measurability constraint on the nominal price. So once all of those prices are set, then all other market outcomes and allocations adjust to the aggregate state. So you can think of this as like a two-stage game where the firms choose their prices. Once prices are set, everything becomes common knowledge and allocations adjust. And in particular, the household chooses its consumption, inputs must adjust so that supply is equal to demand, but the firms can choose their input mix optimally. And then monetary policy, we allow to be contingent on this aggregate state S, but the sectoral taxes are non-state contingent. Okay, so let me go straight to some of the results. So let's first think about what is the first best in this economy. The first best allocation in this economy is just the unique feasible allocation which satisfies these conditions, which is simply that the marginal rate of substitution between consumption of any good and labor is equal to their marginal rate of transformation, which is just the marginal product of labor. And then between any two goods, the marginal rate of substitution between any two goods is equal to their marginal rate of transformation, which is just the marginal product of good J in the technology, in the production of good I. And then efficiency would not only mean that basically these marginal rates of substitution have to equal marginal rates of transformation, but also that there's zero dispersion within quantities within sectors. And that's because all of the firms within the sectors have the same production possibilities. But there should be these movements in quantities across sectors. So whenever there's a shock to a productivity shock in any sector, these relative quantities need to move across sectors. Now let's think about equilibrium. So we define a sticky price equilibrium as well as a flexible price equilibrium. A flexible price equilibrium is just the same as a sticky price equilibrium, except that the price can be contingent on the aggregate state. And what do we find? Well, first, let's think about the flexible price equilibrium. So suppose firms know the state perfectly. These are the conditions that characterize a flexible price equilibrium. They look exactly the same as the planner's conditions. So marginal rates of substitution must equal marginal rates of transformation subject to a wedge. And where is this wedge coming from? This is a non-state contingent wedge that depends solely on the monopolistic markup coming from these firms, as well as the tax on the tax or subsidy on revenues. And therefore, we know that the first best allocation can be implemented under flexible prices as long as you set the subsidy to get rid of the markup, And that's kind of the typical result. So you can implement the efficient allocation under flexible prices. Now let's consider what happens in a sticky price equilibrium. So if you take a sticky price equilibrium, you basically get these sets of conditions, and what these conditions say are the following. So now you have that the marginal rates of substitution are equal to the marginal rates of transformation, subject to two wedges. One was the wedge we had before that's coming from the monopolistic markup as well as taxes, but now you get this other wedge, which looks like a stochastic markup, these epsilons, and these are due to individual firm pricing errors. So now you can see that these depend on omega ik. And this is essentially coming, so you can read this down here, but basically the intuition is simply that these firms don't know what prices to set. They set their prices under incomplete information as best they can to be some markup over their marginal costs. And these stochastic wedges are simply due to these forecast errors of their marginal costs. And because these information sets are different across firms, you're now going to get dispersion within sectors. And these are the conditions that characterize this equilibrium. Okay, so first, our first main result is that these sets are generically disjoint. So if you look at all of the allocations that could potentially be a flexible price allocation and those that could potentially be a sticky price allocation, you get that they are disjoint, and that simply means you cannot implement flexible price allocations under sticky prices, which furthermore implies that you cannot get the first best. The first best allocation cannot generically be implemented under sticky prices. And the intuition is quite simple. It's impossible for any monetary policy to achieve both productive efficiency within sectors as well as relative price movements across sectors. And then in the paper, we go through some examples in which you can achieve the first best, but let me skip that now and just quickly talk about our optimal monetary policy. So think of theta. So now we go to, given that we can't implement the first best, what is the best we can do with monetary policy? And here, think of theta I as being our degree of price flexibility. And it's essentially this kind of signal to noise ratio of these firms. So if they know that state perfectly, theta I is equal to 1, and you have full price flexibility. If theta I is low, you have price stickiness. So first we have a welfare loss decomposition, and we show that the welfare losses can, away from first best for any monetary policy, can be decomposed into 3 components. One is the volatility of the endogenous output gap. Another is misallocation coming from across sectors, as well as misallocation from within sectors. So we solve for the policy along with the equilibrium characterization that minimizes this welfare losses. What we find is that the optimal policy is indeed a price index stabilization policy, and it has 3 components. So basically this is the optimal price index, where this is the weights that you put on each of these sectors. And these weights are basically a linear combination of 3 components. One is the policy that minimizes volatility of the output gap. Another one minimizes within industry misallocation, and another minimizes across industry misallocation. Now, if you dig into what these parameters actually, or what these coefficients actually are, you find that they look very similar to each other in the following sense. So if you take these policies, or these policy coefficients, all of them depend on really 2 things. One is just how large the sector is in terms of its sales share. So this is their DOMAR weight, and how sticky they are. So they're all increasing in lambda I, and they're decreasing in phi I, which is how flexible the sector is. So essentially, if you take a linear combination of these 3 policies, what you get is, what matters is really just these DOMAR weights, these lambda I's, as well as how sticky these sectors are. Okay, so let me wrap up, which is essentially that we find that the optimal price index places the greatest weight on how large sectors are in terms of their DOMAR weights, how sticky sectors are, so low phi I, a couple more things, but quantitatively, what really matters are how large sectors are and how sticky sectors are. Finally, in the last part of the paper, we do a quantitative illustration, we calibrate the model, we find that you can get actually, relatively significant welfare gains from going from the CPI to optimal policy, about 0.5 percentage point of quarterly consumption. And I will just conclude here, which is basically that, okay, we show divine coincidence is non-generic. We then solve for the optimal policy. And in particular, what I want you to take from this presentation is that the optimal policy is a price index stabilization policy that puts the greatest weight on larger sectors in terms of their DOMAR weights and how sticky sectors are. That's it.
Great, awesome. Thanks so much, Jen. If there are any questions from the audience, just post them or raise your hand. If nobody has an urgent question, I'm just going to go first. So if I aggregate the price setting within a sector, given that they all sort of get noisy signals, I'm guessing they're sort of their prices will be log linear functions of their signals.
Mm-hmm.
If I aggregate within a sector, does it look at all like sort of a like a Calvo style sort of pricing? If I aggregate, within sectors, where basically the price that I get is sort of a fraction, as if there was only a fraction that could adjust their price, sort of a fraction of sort of the marginal cost. Is that at all?
Yeah, no, so for sure, yes. Like basically, if you just take the aggregate, okay, so in terms of the theory, if you take the aggregate, what you get within a sector looks a lot like Calvo in the sense that basically, suppose we all have a prior about some shock, and we also get an idiosyncratic signal. So our price will then be a linear combination between our prior and our signal. And basically the more, so the less informative our signal, the closer we are to our prior. So
right.
Now if you aggregate that across a bunch of firms, basically that's going to mean that if you have less informative signals, everyone's a bit closer to their prior. Now that, I think theoretically in the static sense that works out, but I think to answer your question, it's also like a question of like how can you actually calibrate that to the data? So at least for our quantitative section, what we do is, in terms of the data, we don't have a good sense of like the informational frictions that firm face. So we just do it more of the Calvo way, which we just take this data from Paston, Schoenle, and Weber, which is basically about the frequency of price changes. And then we just do kind of a one period, like these are the amount of, this is the fraction of firms that change their price in this period, given that type of data. And then we calibrate to that type of model.
Perfect. Thanks.
So I had a very quick clarifying question. In those expressions where you were showing the sort of the losses, I guess, or the loss function for the consumer, that first term, the output gap volatility term, is it right to think of that as misallocation along the consumption leisure dimension or not?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's one way to do it. It's basically the labor wedge. It's the volatility of the labor wedge.
Okay, so it's like a sum of the misallocation on every margin, the consumption leisure across sectors and then within sectors.
Yeah, let me go back. I should have maybe put them in this presentation, but you're talking about this entire sum here. Yes, so basically this one here, let me talk about each one. So this one is really easy. The within sector is the same as in the Calvo or like the typical New Keynesian model. It's just going to be the elasticity of substitution times the dispersion in prices, essentially. And obviously that makes sense because basically if you have more dispersion in prices, you're going to get more misallocation in terms of goods, and how much that matters depends on the elasticity of substitution. And then you weight each sector there by the DOMAR weights. This one is a little bit more complicated, and it's basically kind of like these covariances between like these it's like, okay, the across one, the intuition is essentially that suppose I'm buying goods from both you and Ludwig, then basically, and I'm a sector, then it depends on kind of how much you guys are making. If you guys are two different sectors, what the average pricing error is in your sectors relative to what they should be under flexible prices. And it's kind of related to these covariances between those and kind of how big these sectors are. So that's this term, which is not as intuitive for me as the first term. And then this one, this volatility in the output gap, is essentially just the volatility of the labor wedge, which you basically get in, you know, a number of your papers with Emmanuel, as well as like my paper with Saki. And it's essentially just, you take the DOMAR, it's a DOMAR weighted average of the labor wedges within each of these sectors. And then you take the volatility of that. That's it.
Any other question for Jen? If not, I have another one. I think it would be really interesting to think about dynamics also. So, you know, I don't know if you've looked at that, but if you had a multi-period model of what happened to the effects of monetary policy positively and normatively. I don't know if that's on your radar or if that's something you've thought about.
So I have not solved for that, or actually Alireza and I have not solved for that. Elisa Rubo does that in more of a typical Calvo model in, yeah, basically for more of a typical Calvo model, she gets, I think, now I'm trying to remember, but she gets pretty much the same results as us for the normal, for the normative type of optimal policy. But I can't remember exactly whether she makes any particular assumptions on the dynamic side of her model to get that. But no, I would say I myself do not know. And I think it would be interesting to do the more dynamic side of this. It gets a little bit difficult with the informational frictions.
Right.
Then whereas like Calvo, like I think you just have to keep track of certain aggregates within each sector.
Right. I guess that's where it starts to make a difference, which I don't know, could be interesting to think about the information friction dynamically too.
Yeah.
Cool.
Great. And then, oh, and it looks like someone has asked a question in the Q&A, but it looks like Alireza is taking an answer. Okay, basically, the question is, if sticky prices are making it impossible to achieve the first best, what is the intuition for advising towards putting more weights on the stickier sectors? So there's really two like intuition, like in terms of the intuition for why you want to put weights on the sticky sectors, it's two things. So one is it helps you in multiple ways, but basically, suppose you have two sectors. Okay, this is really easy. Suppose you have two sectors and one is completely sticky and one is flexible. Okay, you can actually implement the first best there, because what you do is you just stabilize the price of the sticky sector and then the flexible price sector moves accordingly. And hence you can basically replicate allocations from the first best. Now, if you move away from that and the sectors are sort of the same size and one is stickier than the other, you still kind of do the same thing. You want to put more weight on the stickier sector. And what does that help you with? Well, if you look at this equation, it essentially helps you with like, if you stabilize the price of the sticky sectors, then you can get rid of within sector dispersion in that sector, because then all the firms know what price to set, they all set the same price, and hence you have no misallocation within that sector because they're all getting the same amount of inputs and output. And then how do you make sure that the other sector is not misallocated? Well, if the other sector is more flexible, then it can move in the correct way the efficient way with the relative productivity shocks.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much, Jen.
Great.
And Christina is next. John, you raised your hand. Sorry. No. Okay, great. Well, Christina, floor is yours.
Great. Jen, I think I need you to stop sharing. Great. All right. All right, great. Well, thanks so much for having us here today. I'm excited to present our work, Fiscal Policy and Networked Economy. This is joint with Joel Flynn and John Sturm, both of whom are here, and I hope you'll hear a little bit from them during our discussion later on. Okay, so during economic downturns, policymakers who are charged with stabilizing the economy can choose from an array of different policies. So these would include undirected transfers, targeted spending. But in order to choose which of these is kind of most effective, they need to know whom they help and then therefore how they should be targeted. And as we in this session kind of all know, in modern economies, these questions are complicated by potentially rich networks. So things like supply chains, regional trade, heterogeneity, employment and consumption patterns, all can kind of complicate these questions. And so policymakers kind of might need to consider the cascade of expenditures that each of their policies induces. So we're going to take up that research question in this paper, and we're going to be asking how the structure of interconnections between households and firms kind of affects the propagation of fiscal policy. So we're going to do this in two parts. So the first part's going to be theoretical. We're going to develop a model to try to understand how this heterogeneity affects the propagation of shocks. On the firm side, we're going to have heterogeneity with multiple sectors and regions that are connected through an input-output structure. On the household side, we're going to have heterogeneity in both the magnitude and direction of marginal propensities to consume, as well as to allow for heterogeneous employment relationships across firms. And our key result in this part is going to be kind of a novel decomposition that describes how these many dimensions of heterogeneity shape the fiscal multipliers. We're then going to bring this to the data, and we're going to do so by estimating components of the multiplier using several public use data sets. And our core empirical finding here is going to be that these details of the economic interactions, or this kind of network of spending and income, are going to be critical for kind of understanding the distributional impacts of various policies, but they're not going to be particularly relevant for understanding the aggregate impacts of the policies. And so the implication there is that kind of targeting fiscal policy just to those households who have the highest marginal propensities to consume is kind of maximally expansive, and it's going to turn out to be perhaps surprisingly simple. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the model, then talk about the data we're going to use, and I'll jump into some of the empirical results. Okay, so our goal in setting up this model then is to have a setting that's both kind of on the one hand rich enough to capture the many dimensions of heterogeneity I just talked about, but on the other hand is kind of tractable enough that we can bring it directly to the data. So as a broad overview, what we're going to do to that end is we're going to have a two-period model, which is going to have heterogeneous households, regions, and sectors. We're going to focus on a recessionary environment in the first period. So we're going to have a binding zero lower bound and sticky inflation expectations, which are to combine to produce a rigid real interest rate. And we're also going to have downward wage rigidity, which is going to have rigid wages in the first period, meaning that the labor market's not going to be clearing on prices, but we're going to have that labor is rationed to households, as I'll describe in just a moment. And then lastly, we're talking about fiscal policy. So we're going to have a government sector here that's choosing spending and taxes and transfers. Okay, to dig in a little more, we're going to normalize the wage in each period to 1, and we're going to denote the real interest rate as R here, which, as I just said, was going to be fixed. We're going to have firms producing a finite set of goods. They're going to do so using constant returns to scale, and they're going to use a vector of intermediates and a single labor input. And so firms are going to be taking the prices as given, and they're going to be choosing their labor demand and their intermediates to maximize their profits. On the household side, we're going to have a continuum of households of type N, each with some mask mu. They're going to be choosing a vector of goods. They're going to be saving at some rate 1 plus R, and they're going to be supplying labor in both periods. Now, rather than take a stance on the micro foundations of the utility function, we're just going to assume that there exists some Marshallian demand functions that are going to describe the consumption choices of the households as a function of the variables outside of their control. And this is going to allow us to be relatively agnostic about the source of this consumption heterogeneity, which we're instead going to be taking directly from the data. We do, however, assume that these demands satisfy a lifetime budget constraint for the household, where what they earn is what they consume or give to the government. And then lastly, government's going to purchase a vector of goods, and they're going to levy lump sum taxes and transfers, again, subject to their budget constraint. As I mentioned at the beginning, throughout the paper, we're going to be focusing on a rationing equilibrium. So in this equilibrium, first period wages are fixed. And therefore, rather than the labor market clearing on the wage or on the price, it's going to clear on quantities. And workers are going to have their labor supply kind of rationed to them. So it's going to be captured by this rationing function denoted by R here, which is going to take in a vector of labor demands coming from the firms, and it's going to return a labor supply to the households such that this is going to clear the labor market. And this is going to capture this idea that we're in a downturn here. There are households who would like to work, but there aren't firms that are willing to hire them. In the second period, though, we're going to have households choosing their labor supply again. And so the rationing equilibrium is going to be the set of prices, agent, and market level variables such that households are optimizing subject to their budget constraints and this rationing. Firms are maximizing their profits. The first period labor is going to be cleared through this rationing, but all other markets are also going to clear. So that would be second period labor and all goods markets. And it's within this setting then that we're going to consider two shocks, taxes and transfers, as well as spending. And we're going to define the partial equilibrium effect of the shock as the effect it has on kind of gross output before we've allowed incomes to adjust. And in this setting, we're then going to derive an expression here for the income multiplier. It's a generalization of kind of the traditional Keynesian multiplier, and it's going to capture the total effect on value added of a small change in fiscal policy. It looks complicated. I think it's actually quite intuitive. So it looks like the 1 over 1 minus MPC. It has an I minus some kind of MPC-like matrix, and then the inverse. And to understand it, I think it makes sense to read it from the right to the left. So you have here a change in kind of demand for different sectors. This first term here, the I minus X, is going to map that change in final demand to a change in the production of each good coming through this input-output structure. The next term here, this is a matrix of labor shares. It's going to map that change in the production of goods to a change in the labor demand for workers in those sectors and regions. This term here is this rationing function we just talked about. That's going to take, as I said before, the change in labor demand, and it's going to map it into a change in labor supply for different households. And that's going to kind of produce a change in labor incomes. This next term here is the matrix of MPCs for different households. So what that's going to map the change in labor income to a change in consumption. And then lastly, we're going to have this C matrix here, which captures the direction of marginal spending. And it's going to capture what fraction of that marginal spending is going to each sector and region. That then produces a change in the final demand. The whole loop goes back over and over again, and that's captured by this Leontief inverse. Okay, so as you can see here, there are many dimensions of heterogeneity that kind of interact potentially to amplify or dampen the kind of traditional or representative agent Keynesian multiplier. It turns out that those many dimensions can be captured by three network effects. The first of which is an incidence effect. So you get an amplification relative to this baseline when shocks disproportionately hit households who have higher MPCs. The second is a bias effect, which is that you get amplification when the shock, when kind of agents are directing their marginal spending towards households who have higher MPCs. And the third is what we term an homophily effect, which is that you get amplification when there's a correlation between the MPCs and the MPCs of the households on which they're doing their marginal spending. So rather than talk through the details of the math here, which looks a little messy, I'm going to go through a couple of examples just to kind of solidify the intuition for these three network effects. But before I move on, I'll just mention quickly that this is an approximation and there are potentially higher order terms here. We show in the paper the approximation is quite tight, which motivates kind of our empirical focus on these three terms. Okay, so on to the examples. I want you to consider a setting. There's two households, one with a relatively high MPC 0.5, that person works in a restaurant, one with a relatively low MPC 0.1, that person works in car manufacturing. And in the examples I'm going to go through, I'm going to have differences both in the incidence of the transfer, as well as differences in the structure of the economy, so differences in the spending to income network. So the first case is going to be neutral incidence in a neutral network. Here, the government's going to split the transfer half and half between the low MPC and the high MPC guy. They're all going to spend their marginal dollars kind of half and half on each sector. They go half to restaurants, half buy new cars. And here you're going to get that the shock's going to it's going to be as if the economy had kind of a single household who had the average MPC of these two workers in the economy, and the multiplier is going to be given by 1 over 1 minus that average MPC. The second case is going to be where we're going to have a different incidence. So here, consider the case where the government gives all of the initial transfer to the high MPC type. Well, the first round of this multiplier is going to propagate at the MPC of the high type. The second and subsequent rounds are then going to propagate at the MPC of the average, because everyone's kind of splitting their marginal dollars. And so you're going to get an amplification here that comes from this incidence, that comes from the fact that this first round happens, the kind of amplification happens at a higher MPC. Okay, to give you a sense of the bias, consider a third example here, where now we're going to go back to the neutral incidence. But here, the economy is structured such that all of the households are spending their marginal dollars going out to restaurants. So they're spending on the sector that employs the high MPC worker. And here, you're going to have the first rounds propagating at the average MPC in the economy, but all higher rounds are propagating at the MPC of the high type. And so here, you're going to get that amplification coming from this kind of bias effect. And then lastly, for the last network effect, consider kind of a different structure of the economy, wherein now each sector is just spending back on their own sector. So the high MPC types, they're all buying cars, or sorry, they're all eating in restaurants. The low MPC are all buying cars. Maybe more naturally, think of two regions. They're disparate. In this case, the shocks are just going to propagate separately, but because of the convexity and the multiplier, you're going to get this amplification as well. So this is kind of an example of the homophily effect. Okay, so with that, we're kind of ready to jump into the data and kind of explore which dimensions are kind of most important empirically. So remember, there's kind of this sufficient statistic that we derived for the generalized income multiplier. We're going to estimate this in 2012. We're going to have data from 51 states, 55 sectors, and 82 demographic groups that are the combination of kind of income, age, gender, and race. And to do this, we need to estimate kind of 3 key objects, which I'll just talk about at a very high level. The first is this regional input-output matrix here. We're going to compute this by combining the BEA input-output tables with regional input-output tables that we estimate from the commodity flows survey using the flow of tradable goods across sectors. And in doing so, we're going to assume that kind of all non-tradables are consumed within the state, and that this input-output structure is the same in all of the states. The second we need is this rationing matrix. This is going to map, again, that change in demand to a change in income. We're going to get this by combining state by industry labor shares with the distribution of workers across regions and estimates from some of my previous work on the kind of elasticity of worker earnings with respect to changes in demand across demographics. And then third, we're going to need a directed marginal propensity to consume matrix, which is going to take the change in income and map it into a change in demand for different sectors in different regions. And we're going to get this by combining estimates of MPCs for different demographic groups with the kind of consumption basket shares for different demographic groups for different goods, which we're going to get from the CEX. And then we're also going to get this geographic component by using cross-state flows from the commodity flows survey. And the key assumption here I'll just highlight is that we're going to be assuming that for each demographic group, there are linear angle curves, meaning that the MPC for food for a demographic group is just going to be the MPC for that demographic group times that group's share of food in their basket. Okay, and with that, we're ready to kind of just jump into some results. So our first result is going to be that we're going to find a lot of dispersion in government purchase multipliers, kind of depending on where the government is targeting their purchase. So on the y-axis here, I have the multiplier you get from spending $1 in any of the state by industry pairs. And you can see here they range from about 1.1 up to around 1.6. We also calculate an aggregate multiplier for government purchases. We find that to be around 1.3. And we define this as the multiplier that would exist if the government purchased a GDP proportional basket of goods. In the sake of time, I'm just showing you here the government purchases multipliers, but in the paper, we show that we find even larger dispersion for transfer multipliers. Okay, so there's heterogeneity here. Where is it coming from? So as we talked about with those examples, it could be coming from kind of the incidence, it could be coming from the bias or from homophily effects. Empirically, it turns out it's all coming from the incidence effect. So this scatter plot demonstrates kind of the patterns in the data that drive that result. So each dot here is the demographic group. The x-axis is the MPC we estimated for that group. And the y-axis is what we term the basket weighted network MPC, which means it's the average MPC of the workers who receive the income from that group's marginal spending. So for example, if this is a group that spends all of their marginal dollars on housing, then this here would be the MPC of the workers who produce an additional unit of housing, both directly and kind of through the input-output network. So the people who do advertising, real estate and agents, and so on. The dotted line is kind of the reference, the MPC with our reference income weighting, which we take to be the weighting that's proportional to state industry GDP. So there's two observations from this chart that are going to tell you about the size of these network effects. The first is that these basket weighted network MPCs are very similar. They range only from about 0.2 to 0.24. So that leaves very little scope for this homophily, this correlation between your MPC and the MPC of the workers on whom you're spending your marginal dollars. And the second is that all of these are actually quite close to this kind of benchmark average MPC. And that's going to mean that the second and higher loops of the multiplier chain are going to propagate at something that's kind of quite close to this reference. And together, these are going to imply that these bias and homophily terms are zero, and that all that heterogeneity in the previous chart was really coming just from heterogeneity incidence, the heterogeneity and kind of the MPCs of the workers who are receiving those kind of initial marginal dollars. This doesn't mean the consumption network is irrelevant. While they don't contribute meaningfully to kind of the aggregate, it does contribute meaningfully to the kind of understanding the distribution of fiscal effects. So just to give you a flavor of that, what I'm showing you here is the effect on output in each state from the government transferring $1 to workers in Michigan. So what we see here is that the effect is largest in Michigan, but the total effect is 69-cent increase in output, and only 29 cents of that, we estimate, is in Michigan itself, which is less than half. These spillovers are coming from both firms in Michigan using inputs from other states, also from workers in Michigan buying goods in other states, and then those kind of initial purchases kind of working their way through the network system in the other states as well. Okay, and in the very last maybe 1 minute, I'm going to talk briefly about kind of what these patterns imply for the implementation of fiscal policy. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over any of the details here, but I'll just give a broad overview of the setting we're considering. So we're thinking about kind of cross-sectional heterogeneity. We're going to be focusing on the setting in which there's some amount of funds available for fiscal spending. The financing of that is fixed. And the question then facing the social planner is how should they allocate those funds then across the economy? So we show in the paper that the kind of the intuitive result that the finding that the direction of marginal spending doesn't matter for the distribution of multipliers means that if the social planner is kind of solely interested in maximizing aggregate output, then they should simply target their policies so that they directly affect the incomes of the household with the highest MPCs. If everyone's spending their marginal dollars in the same way for the purposes of amplification, it doesn't matter who you give it to, you just want to give it to those who are just going to spend the most. So the figure here shows kind of the effectiveness of that simple MPC targeting. So on the y-axis, this is now for transfers. I showed you, I have the multiplier of giving a $1 transfer to any kind of demographic by region group. And on the x-axis, I have the estimated MPC for that group. And you can see here, there's a near perfect correlation. So you're going to kind of get the largest multiplier by transferring to the group that has the highest MPC. I don't have it here, but in the paper, we show this is mostly still true for government spending. But there, it's a little more complicated. You can't just target the MPC of the workers in that industry, but you need to consider the MPC of the workers that supply the intermediate inputs for that industry and kind of so on. So you need to take into the network to some extent there. Okay, with that, I'll conclude. This paper develops a model to kind of understand the propagation of fiscal shocks with kind of worker and firm heterogeneity. We express these fiscal multipliers in terms of estimable statistics that we could take kind of directly from the data. We found that the network structure mattered for kind of understanding the distribution, the distributional impacts of various policies. But for the aggregate, it was really only the MPC incidence that matters. And since we found that there was a wide range of multipliers depending on where in the economy the policy was targeted, it suggests that targeting fiscal policy is potentially both important and maybe surprisingly simple. So I'll leave it there and open it up for questions. And I hope to give John and Joel a chance to kind of jump in here as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Christina. I think there's already a question in the Q&A. If you want to take a shot at it, I'm happy to read it out loud. So it's from Tao Wang, who is wondering about different assumptions in consumer preferences. I know you didn't spell out preferences, but I think he's interested in complementary versus substitutable goods in the utility function. And so whether that sort of amplifies or dampens multipliers.
Christina, I'm happy to take this one if that works.
Great, thanks.
So I think whether goods are complements or substitutes in consumption isn't really important for our analysis because since prices are sticky in the short run, there aren't going to be any price adjustments. And so we don't have to think about this issue of one good becomes cheaper. Does that mean I also, consume more of its complement? All that really matters for us is what are my MPCs towards these different goods, which could be affected by whether they're complements or substitutes. And in that case, we're maybe ruling some of that out when we go to the data and we assume these linear angle curves.
Great.
Can I ask a question? Are linear angle curves, is that sort of typical? Like, basically, you would think, wouldn't it be that if you increase someone's wealth or income, they might change their composition with the consumption goods?
I can take this if you'd like. I mean, we capture that in a coarse way because we have linear angle curves within each income group. So we still allow for non-linearity of the angle curve across different levels of income. But within our income buckets, we're imposing that if you get a little more income, you scale up proportionally with respect to how much you were consuming before.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so we, as Joel said, we address that somewhat. I mean, you're absolutely right. It would be ideal if we could kind of estimate the MPC for particular goods by demographic group, which we just kind of don't have the power to do here. One thing we were able to do is we were able to use some of the, so this comes from mostly from the PSID, and then the consumption shares come from the CEX. But in the later years of the PSID, we do have different baskets of different types of consumption. And we were able to kind of think to kind of somewhat validate that, not by demographic group, given the size of the PSID, but overall. And what we find is actually that the kind of approximation does pretty well. So your MPC is kind of, we can't reject that they kind of line up with what we would have gotten if we just took the share of consumption times the aggregate MPC. But but that is kind of a limitation of the consumption data we have.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question about the way the factor market works? I didn't quite understand it. So there's this like rationing equilibrium, which I would have thought of as like, I should think that the labor supply curve is kind of perfectly horizontal. And so labor demand determines employment, but it sounds like that's not how I should be thinking of it. It's like an upward sloping thing, or not.
The first thing you said is exactly correct. Everything's totally labor demand determined.
I see. Okay. And so that's why relative prices are not going to move at all, because all factor prices are pinned down. So then I had two kind of related questions to that. The first one is, have you thought about what happens if you have factor markets that are clearing? Because if I think of like capital markets, maybe I want those to clear. And so that's going to induce some fluctuations in prices. And then the other thing I was wondering about is, if all the labor supply curves are perfectly horizontal, then what's the like rationing elasticity thing that's showing up? The like R1, L1, L1. What is that object?
Great.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
let me start from the end. So this R1 sub L object is just sort of the Jacobian that maps firm-specific labor demand to how much labor ends up being supplied by each demographic group. And they could be region-specific demographic groups. So that's just sort of telling you, who is it in practice that the firms actually take the labor from? And we're trying to be sort of reduced form and empirical about just measuring that in the data. So that was one question. The second question was about price, or the first question was about price adjustments. And if we've thought about that at all, I'm happy to have Joel or Christina chime in here. One thing that we've thought about a little bit is in the aggregate, this framework all still sort of works if you think that intertemporal prices are adjusting. So you could think of, maybe there's a Taylor rule, and the Taylor rule is responding to aggregate output. And then you might ask the question, given that the planner wants to achieve a certain level of aggregate output, how can they do that at the lowest cost? So in that case, you'd sort of be fixing how much is aggregate output going to move, how much therefore are real interest rates going to respond, take everyone's response to real interest rates as given, and then on top of that, the planner can be trying to figure out how to stimulate incomes to achieve that at the lowest cost. So that's an intertemporal answer to your question. Joel or Christina, do you want to respond at all to the intratemporal component?
Can I add one question, also very clarifying to David's question? What I didn't quite get at the beginning in the model, is there a single type of labor, or are there multiple types of labor, multiple factors here? And, just maybe you could comment on that in your answer.
Yeah, so for us, we're thinking of there being a single type of labor in our baseline, and you could think of a richer model in which there are many types of labor that all have perfectly rigid relative wages in the short run, and that would work for us too. So the question of prices changing. So because we're considering these demand shocks in our setting, you're exactly right, David, prices are pinned down by non-substitution. If you allowed for supply shocks, like we had production shifters, then prices would move too. And actually in this model, you can still derive a formula, in fact, for how those prices move. We've not implemented that empirically, but that's in the appendix to the paper. And that adds an additional term to thinking about the multiplier.
Well, so I mean, like when I think about the problem of stimulating the economy, I feel like a big part of it is that you wouldn't want to just have your stimulus go to waste by bidding up the factor price for factor markets that are clearing. So I'm thinking like, high skilled workers during a recession, their labor market is at full employment. And one of the considerations I want to think about is I don't want to waste stimulus just raising their wages. And so that's kind of the thing I was thinking about is whether or not it's possible to go a step further here and try to kind of think about that dimension of the problem as well.
I think we have a partial answer to that insofar as income is going to high skilled workers who have low margin utility. That will be captured in the planner's problem as a low weight on those groups. And on a generalized planner's problem that we present in the paper, that would mean you'd like to transfer income to them less. Similarly, if they are closer to being on their labor supply curve and they have a smaller labor wedge in their intratemporal labor supply condition, you would care less about stimulating them. That we have implemented empirically using estimated rationing wedges across space in the Great Recession. And we find that there are gains from targeting on both the combination of the size of the multiplier and the size of the labor wedge defined in that gap in the intratemporal Euler equation.
Yeah, I think just exactly, Joel. I think just to highlight, maybe David, just to summarize exactly. I mean, the kind of punchline of this MPC targeting is most effective for a planner who's solely seeking to maximize aggregate output. And of course, that's only true under kind of a very particular set of assumptions. And so in the paper, we then kind of try to say, okay, as you kind of relax those assumptions, that mean that now the kind of planner has other incentives, such as the ones that you were talking about. You can still use the kind of structure of our system to kind of think about where they might want to target it. And it uses it's more kind of empirically and demanding, and we kind of try to build on that. But yeah, you can still think about those sort of concerns within this framework. But you're absolutely right that the kind of key punchline about the MPC targeting doesn't hold exactly as you move away from that.
David, that's also something I'll be mentioning in half an hour, so I'll have something to say about that too. Great, but thanks so much again, Christina, John, Joel. That was fantastic. David is up next. Really looking forward to that.
Okay, hopefully everybody can see. So thanks a lot for inviting us to present in this session. The paper is called Supply Side Effects of Monetary Policy. It's joint work with Emmanuel and Kunal Sangani. Kunal is a phenomenal PhD student who is here today. And, you know, it goes without saying that I think we're all kind of still in shock and depressed about the fact that Emmanuel's not with us anymore. I mean, I think about it every single day. I really miss him, and it's a real tragedy that he's not here today. I wish he could be. So hopefully I can do him proud today. So this paper, the question that we're asking in this paper is there a reason to think that aggregate demand shocks can affect aggregate productivity in an economy? So the standard answer is that they do not. Aggregate demand is determined by things like changes in preferences or interest rates or fiscal policy or things like that, things that affect consumption expenditures and spending decisions. And aggregate productivity is determined by fundamental changes to the technology that's available, things like movements in the production possibility frontier. And these things kind of, in the classic view, they don't have anything to do with each other. This is sort of the common view that the literature often takes. And if you take this view, then there's like an awkward fact in the data that you have to explain, which is that aggregate productivity, if you try to measure it, looks like it's very pro-cyclical and looks like it responds to aggregate demand shocks. So for example, aggregate productivity moves with monetary policy shocks, and aggregate productivity moves with changes in fiscal policy. And so the classic resolution for this empirical paradox is to say, well, we don't know how to measure aggregate productivity correctly. Somehow we are screwing it up when we try to measure aggregate productivity. And the fact that we observe these movements in aggregate productivity in response to things like nominal shocks is just the consequence of mismeasurement. In this paper, we take a different perspective and we say that, well, actually, if you write down a model with realistic firm level heterogeneity, and I'm going to be very precise about what I mean when I say that, then there's actually a very good theoretical reason why you should expect aggregate productivity to respond endogenously to things like changes in nominal aggregate demand, including things like monetary policy. So this is we're going to present a model that endogenously delivers this as a prediction. So the question is, how could it be that something like monetary policy, which is changing aggregate demand, can affect aggregate productivity? In this paper, the way it's going to work is that a monetary expansion is going to raise aggregate productivity and it's going to raise output by raising allocative efficiency in the economy. That means that the initial allocation of resources is inefficient, and somehow monetary expansion brings you closer to the efficient frontier. So how does that happen? Why would that happen? Well, in order for this to happen, you need two conditions. These are both necessary. The first one is that you need the initial allocation of resources to be inefficient. So if you start your model at an efficient point, you're not going to see things like this. The second thing you need to be true is that you need the monetary expansion to systematically reallocate resources from low to high marginal revenue product firms. So even if you start at an inefficient point, if monetary policy is just randomly moving things around, then you're not going to get anything interesting. In order for you to see something interesting, there has to be a systematic kind of reallocation. And what we point out in this paper is that both of these conditions, there's good reason to think both of these conditions are satisfied in the data. First of all, the initial allocation of resources is likely to be inefficient because firms have persistently different markups. So some firms like to charge high markups, some firms like to charge low markups, and these are persistent, and that's going to give you a misallocation in any initial equilibrium. So that satisfies the first condition. The second condition is satisfied by the fact that it turns to be in the data that firms with high markups tend to absorb cost shocks into their markups and not pass it into their prices. This is called incompleteness of pass-through, and it's something that co-varies with the level of the market. So if you are selling a very expensive product that has a very high markup, it's a very fancy product. If your marginal cost changes, you're less likely to pass that into your price than if you're a guy who's selling $2 chuck or something very cheap, and when the cost changes, you immediately pass it into your price. And if you have that kind of systematic differences in pass-through, you're going to get naturally this kind of reallocation that I mentioned every time there's a monetary expansion. And so this is going to result in a new channel by which monetary policy can affect the real economy. So what we're going to find is that a monetary easing under these conditions that I mentioned, which are empirically the relevant ones, a monetary easing is going to raise aggregate TFP, and it's going to generate an endogenous positive aggregate supply shock that coincides with the positive aggregate demand shock. And so what that means is it's going to amplify the impact and persistence of monetary shocks, but also other kinds of demand shocks. So like basically anything that you can think of as a shifter in the Euler equation. So discount factor shock would work the same way. And what we're going to find is that aggregate TFP is going to fall after a monetary contraction without there being any kind of technological regress. Firm level TFPR dispersion is going to be counter-cyclical, but it's got nothing to do with uncertainty shocks or things like that. And you're going to get a flatter Phillips curve, and the slope of the Phillips curve is going to be linked to things like industrial concentration. And finally, we provide some evidence that the reallocations that the model is predicting are consistent with patterns you see in the data. Okay, so I'm gonna, since I don't have that much time, I'm going to just give you a static model, and then once you understand the intuition of the static model, then I'll show you a dynamic model, which it sort of follows very naturally. And then I'll show you a quantitative illustration to say these forces are important. And then I don't think I'll have time for the empirical evidence, but you can imagine that there's some empirical evidence. Okay, so what's the static model? It's very simple. We're going to have monopolistic competition. We're going to have heterogeneous firms. So these are firms that have heterogeneous marginal costs, heterogeneous productivity, heterogeneous markups, heterogeneous pass-throughs. And then we're going to have cowbell pricing, one step ahead kind of cowbell pricing overlaid on top of this. The key deviation relative to the standard model is that we're going to use Kimball demand, a generalized form of Kimball demand instead of CES. And that's very, very important for us. So the way the equilibrium is going to work is in the initial equilibrium, firms are sort of they're in the steady state with no shocks. They're at the flex price equilibrium. Then a monetary authority introduces a nominal shock. And then you have adjustment where some fraction of firms can adjust, some fraction cannot, and then you establish a new equilibrium. So this is the household side of the model. Households are maximizing their utility. Big Y is real GDP in this model. Big L is labor supply. Zeta is the frisch. And the key thing is that output in the model is going to be determined implicitly by this thing, which is a Kimball aggregator. So this is a generalization of CES, and you're going to find out why it's a very useful generalization of CES in a second. But you can think there's this upsilon function that is going to relate aggregate output to the individual varieties of different goods that are consumed. So if I make upsilon a power function, then this is CES. But it allows me to move away from CES in this tractable way. And then budget constraint is the usual thing. So what about the production side? Every variety is produced by a single producer. that is subject to a Calvo friction. So with probability 1 minus delta, they get to adjust the price. With probability delta, they don't get to adjust the price. And theta here is like the type of the producer. So there's producers of different types, and we're going to allow the Calvo parameter to potentially vary by firm type. And production is linear, so every firm is just making the good using constant marginal cost, which is the wage, divided by the productivity shifter. So what the firms are doing is they're setting prices to maximize profits, subject to their residual demand curve. And here's kind of the beauty of these Kimball preferences. What you see is that the residual demand curve takes a simple form like this that says relative quantity for variety theta is related to some relative price. And the shape of the residual demand curve is given by the derivative of this epsilon function. So now a CES would make this a power function. So the residual demand curve has to be isoelastic. This demand system allows you to pick whatever downward sloping shape you like. And in particular, this downward sloping shape could be different for different firms. They don't even all have to face the exact same demand curve, if you like. So the equilibrium is the standard thing. The bank is going to choose a nominal price. I'm going to pick the nominal wage as the price they pick. And then once the nominal wage has been picked, then a new equilibrium has to be established. So let's think about how monetary policy is going to affect output in this economy. So monetary policy, which is going to, in this simple model, is just going to be a change in the nominal wage, is going to affect output in two ways. One is it's going to change employment. One is it's going to change productivity. Now, in the standard model, productivity, which I'm thinking of is like real GDP per worker, is not going to move in a standard New Keynesian model. But in this model, this is what we're interested in, that productivity is itself going to start responding to these shocks. To think about how productivity is going to respond, I need a few statistics that are important about the shape of the demand curve. So I need the price elasticity of the demand for each firm. So this is some function sigma. It relates to derivatives of epsilon, as you might imagine. I'm going to define desired markup for each firm type, which is a function of the price elasticity. So in CES, sigma is a number and mu is a number. Here, they're going to vary for different firms. And then finally, I'm going to define the pass-through, which is the in partial equilibrium. What is the elasticity of your price with respect to your marginal cost? So in CES, this is equal to 1 because your desired markup is constant. But in this world, every time your marginal cost changes and you move up and down the demand curve, your desired markup changes. That means that because you're changing your markup, you don't pass your marginal cost into your price 1 for 1. And so in general, this is going to be some number that's different to 1. And finally, I'm going to define the sales share density of these firm types as lambda. Okay, very good. So here is how TFP is going to respond to a nominal shock in this model. So it has two components. I'm going to talk through them one by one. The first thing I want you to notice is there's two constants here, which are both just positive. So you can forget about them. Whether this is positive, 0, or negative depends on these covariances. So what are these covariances? The first covariance is the covariance between pass-throughs and price elasticities among the flexible firms. So this is the idea that suppose that the firms that have very elastic demand curves, the very elastic low markup guys, are the ones who also have high pass-throughs. In that case, this covariance is positive. In that case, every time there's a nominal shock, TFP will go up. This is happening because of reallocations that happen due to heterogeneous pass-throughs. So every time the nominal marginal cost goes up because of aggregate demand, the high markup firms do not change their prices by as much as the low markup firms. That means that the low markup firms are putting their price up, but the high markup firms are not doing it by as much, which means demand shifts towards the high markup firms. But these high markup firms are exactly the firms that were inefficiently too small from a social perspective. That causes aggregate TFP to increase. So that's heterogeneity due to desired pass-through. And so there's lots of things that you might think could drive this. For example, size is a typical one, which is to say big firms tend to have high markups and low pass-throughs. That's going to generate a covariance that looks like this. But there's other things that could drive it. So for example, quality is another one. High quality goods tend to have high markups and low pass-throughs. And so those could both be generating this positive covariance. There's an alternative mechanism that gives you basically the same thing, which is a covariance between the Calvo parameter and the price elasticity of demand. So if the high markup guys are more sticky than the low markup guys, you're going to get a similar thing. Because ultimately what matters is realized pass-through. And realized pass-through is a combination of the Calvo parameter and desired pass-through. And so if either component is covariant systematically with the markup or the price elasticity, you're going to get effects like this. Now, every time aggregate productivity in this model goes up, it also implies that TFPR dispersion is going to go down. So this is sort of tying an aggregate productivity moment, which is aggregate TFP, to a micro level TFPR moment, which is TFPR dispersion. And these are both things that we see in the data. TFPR dispersion at the firm level is very countercyclical, and aggregate productivity is very pro-cyclical. So here is what pass-throughs look like in the data. So these are some estimates that I took from a paper by Mariam Iti and her co-authors. And what you see is that the pass-through for firms is, so this is plotting pass-through against the size of the firms for manufacturing firms. And what you see is that for the 80% of the smallest firms in the economy, their pass-through is almost 1. So this is average pass-through up to the 80th percentile. But once you start including bigger firms, the pass-through starts to decline quite a bit. So lots of small firms that look CES, and then lots of firms that don't look CES and have very low pass-throughs. And these are also the guys with the relatively high markups. Okay, very good. So this is the way TFP is responding to shocks. How does GDP respond to shocks? So this is the way GDP responds to shocks. It has two components. The way GDP responds to shocks has a demand component and a supply component. The supply component, I already explained to you what it was. It's just the change in TFP that you saw in the previous expression. There's also the traditional demand side Keynesian effect in this model, which is that every time the nominal marginal cost goes up because of a monetary expansion, the average markup falls, because the sticky price guys can adjust their price, so their markup is cut. Because the average markup falls, that means you're stimulating labor demand. And because you're stimulating labor demand, you're going to get a boost in employment, and that's going to boost GDP. So you can see that this effect is super dependent on the Frisch elasticity of labor supply. If labor supply is inelastic, there is no Keynesian demand effect in this model. Zeta equals 0, the effect disappears. But notice that there would still be a TFP effect, because that one doesn't operate through labor supply. And the demand side component depends, as I say, on the average cut in the markup, which depends on sticky prices and real rigidities. So this is strategic complementarities in pricing. So these are sort of the traditional mechanisms that the literature has emphasized. And then here's this new mechanism that we're emphasizing. And as you can imagine, if you've got this force operating inside the model, then you're going to get a flattening of the wage and price Phillips curves. Because every time you do a positive aggregate demand shock, there's this positive aggregate supply shock that shows up, which keeps inflation down and means that the Phillips curve gets flatter. Okay, great. So now that hopefully the static model is clear, I'm going to show you what the dynamic model looks like. So how are we going to do the dynamic model? So we're going to assume that every firm is, we're just going to do a new Keynesian model, basically. So take the 3-equation new Keynesian setup, but now allow for this additional angle of heterogeneity that we've got going. So every firm is setting price to maximize expected profits subject to a Calvo friction. There's a standard Euler equation for the household. There's a standard Taylor rule for the nominal interest rate. And for the expressions I show you today, I'm going to assume that the Calvo parameter is homogeneous. So there's no differential stickiness by firm. Everybody has the same Calvo. So here's what the dynamic model looks like. The Taylor rule is exactly the same as it would be in the standard model. The dynamic IS or Euler equation is exactly like it would be in the standard model. The first equation that starts to look different is the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So the new Keynesian Phillips curve has two distinctions relative to chapter 3 of Gali. The first one is that you have a term that is flattening the slope of it. This is just the average pass-through in this model is less than 1. This is real rigidities. It's just making the Phillips curve flatter. But more importantly, you've got an extra term, an extra disturbance inside the New Keynesian Phillips curve, which are movements in aggregate TFP. And these movements in aggregate TFP are themselves determined by an extra equation. So instead of your 3-equation New Keynesian model, you now get a 4-equation New Keynesian model where there's an endogenous equation that determines the movements in aggregate TFP. So what do I want you to take away from this? The main thing I want you to take away from this is if this covariance that I've been emphasizing is positive, so high pass-through, high price elasticity firms, low pass-through, low price elasticity firms, then every time GDP goes up, TFP goes up contemporaneously, and that sets in motion movements in aggregate productivity, which then look like good cost push shocks inside the Phillips curve. One thing that's interesting about this is all of these equations are all first-order difference equations, but this one is a second-order difference equation. So this gives some hump-shaped responses in the impulse response functions endogenously, which is sort of nice. Okay, so I'm like totally out of time. Okay, so now the static model that I showed you is a special case of this model when you set the discount factor equal to 0 and look at the effect on impact of a shock. So very quickly, I'm going to show you a quantitative illustration. So what we do is we take that pass-through data that I showed you, and we say, what is a Kimball aggregator that can generate this pass-through series? So this is like the solution to a differential equation. You solve this differential equation, you get the shape of the Kimball aggregator. Then we take that Kimball aggregator and we simulate the model. And so here's what you find. This is the dynamic model. So if you have a contractionary interest rate shock, each line corresponds to a different calibration. So CES is Gali chapter 3. That's the green line. The orange line is Gali chapter 3 plus real rigidity. So we just have homogeneous firms. There's no misallocation, but they have incomplete pass-through. So there's strategic complementarities in prices. And then the blue line is the benchmark model. And so what you can see is that the benchmark model basically makes this contractionary monetary shock have a bigger effect on GDP than on prices. So it's effectively, it's making monetary policy more powerful. It can move output more. And the amount by which it's empowering monetary policy is about as strong as real rigidities on their own. So this in practice is probably a pretty important channel that we have to account for. And what you can see is the way that the gap between GDP is driven between the orange and the blue line is because of the movements in aggregate TFP, which is when you do a contractionary monetary shock, aggregate TFP falls, and then it takes a while to recover. And because it's falling and taking a while to recover, GDP is going to be lower. And on the flip side of this is TFDR dispersion is rising. Okay, I think I'm like totally out of time. So I'm going to wrap up. We have some empirical evidence to show that the kind of reallocations the model predicts are consistent with the data. And then in the paper, there's some extensions to having multiple sectors, multiple factors, input-output linkages. These are things that people in this room are interested in. So you can do it with those things. You can also do this stuff with oligopoly if you prefer. Like an Atkinson-Bernstein model would generate the same kind of covariance between pass-throughs and the level of the markup. And that's the key. The Kimball is sort of just the device to get there. So to wrap up, hopefully what you'll take away today is that if there are initial distortions, then demand shocks can affect productivity and they can affect it through allocative efficiency. And these effects can be powerful if price flexibility or pass-through co-varies with the level of the market. And so ongoing work, obviously, to expand this to thinking about other kinds of demand shocks and optimal policy and so on. I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a bunch, David. That was excellent. I'm just going to take the liberty to shoot the first question. Oh, Jen, did you want to? I didn't want to shut you off. Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to ask now that I'm at it. This is maybe related to some of the slides you skipped. But I was thinking, so if I take a step back and just think about reallocation between high and low markup firms in response to monetary policy, I guess it would be because cyclicalities of different sectors, they are different for other reasons as well.
Yes.
And I think it would be interesting to just sort of say what's the covariance between how sensitive sectoral demand is to monetary policy overall, wherever that's coming from, and sort of how high is the markup, right? Because then I, see across channels, durable, non-durable, whatever.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so you're asking a very good question, and this comes up a lot. So I think a lot of people, their first inclination, especially if they're macro people, is to think about sectoral differences. So like you're saying, like durable, non-durable, or something like that. I don't want you to think like that. I want you to think about this as happening within a given sector. This is not a model across sectors. Now, my belief is that if you were to really dig into this and try to do a big, complicated sectoral model where you have firm level heterogeneity within each sector and then sectors that are interacting with each other, the sectoral part of this stuff is going to be pretty small. The reason is because there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that elasticities of substitution are important here. So basically, like, you need it to be that if relative prices are different, demand moves. And at the sectoral level, these elasticities are not that high. So across firms, like if Walmart is giving you a better price than Kmart, you're really going to start going to Walmart. But if like Apple is giving you, changes its price relative to electricity, you're not really going to move demand. So these elasticities of substitution at the sector level are quite a bit lower, which means that you don't get as much reallocation, even if you have differences in markups and even if you have differences in relative prices in response to monetary shocks. That's the first thing. The second thing is across sectors, the factor markets are probably different too. Like if electricity is using like electrical workers and Walmart is using, people who work in retail, then if they're not sharing factors, they're not sharing resources, there's no misallocation to solve. Even if you have relative markups, the extent of misallocation is very, very small because they're not like sharing resources. So for both of these reasons, I suspect the sectoral angle is actually not key here. What you really should be thinking about is like wine or something, there's like fancy wine which has a high price, a high markup, and they don't change the price that quickly if there's a change in their costs. And then there's like super cheapo wine that's being sold at marginal cost almost, and they're going to adjust the price quickly. And then a continuum that fills out one end to the other. And then you can see if relative prices move, people are going to start moving across different categories of wine. That's sort of how I want you to think about it. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
No, that was as good as an answer as any. That was awesome. Thanks.
Can I just ask a quick quantitative question? And I may have missed this. So you have these two covariances. One is between markup and pass-through, which to me seems very intuitive. And then the other one, the flexibility, is that quantitatively significant, or what are you finding there? So for that, you would need like a firm level measure of the Calvo parameter, because like I said, because you're doing the firm level. Okay. Yeah. So like there's stuff like Gorodnichenko and Weber have these estimates at the sector level. And so certainly you could do this stuff at the sector level and see whether or not there's a covariance, like Ludwig was saying, between the sectoral markup and the sectoral Calvo parameter. But as I say, I suspect quantitatively, those are going to not be where the key story is. Yeah. Okay. And then I don't know if we have a ton of evidence on the firm level thing. Yeah. Whereas the pass through and exactly. So for the quantitative results, I just shut this channel down, and all the quantitative results I showed you assumed a homogeneous Calvo, and everything was coming from the desired pass through. Perfect. Thanks.
Can I? Oh. John,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Christina.
All right, can I jump in? This is kind of a bit of an out there question, but you're thinking about this in monetary policy in a cyclical sense, but actually making me think a lot about some of like other literature on thinking about like reallocation and kind of the rise of markups and things like that. And kind of in more of these kind of looking at longer term trends. And have you guys thought, and in particular, they find that it's a kind of within sector reallocation across firms, kind of towards high markup firms or low labor share, or, have you thought about how this may kind of relate to some of those patterns and what it might mean for kind of the effect of a rise in markups on sensitivity to monetary policy?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I removed the relevant slide. oh, no, I haven't. So what does this say? This says industrial concentration. Okay, so here is the thought experiment we tried in the paper, which is to say, suppose that I try to match the changes in concentration over time. So like, let's say I change the underlying productivity distribution of firms so that over time, like the bigger high markup firms start to get bigger, and that raises the Gini coefficient in employment. And then I try to match the Gini coefficient and how it's changed in, let's say, the US, just to get some quantitative sense of how much this matters over time. So like the Gini coefficient in the retail sector in the US at the aggregate level, it has increased by some amount, which goes from like maybe 0.7 to about 0.85 or something like that, from like the late 70s to the late 2010s. So if you go from here to here, you sort of are following the aggregate trend of the Gini coefficient. And then what this plot is showing you is the slope of the price and wage Phillips curves. Now, in the sticky price model alone with CES, you don't get anything because the slope of the Phillips curve doesn't depend on industrial concentration. If you have like the real rigidities mechanism in our paper operating, then as you push towards the big firms who have lower average pass-throughs, that's going to look like average pass-through is going down, and so it's going to strengthen real rigidities. And so you can see the slope of the Phillips curve is falling, both the price and the wage Phillips curve. And then if you put our mechanism on top, then it's going to make it even stronger, because again, you're increasing like the extent of misallocation, and you're sort of moving away from this kind of like world in which firms are more homogeneous. And so that's going to also push up, that's increasing these covariances, and that's going to push down the slope of the price and wage Phillips curve even more. So to that, in that sense, this model does have something to say about how changes in concentration affect the strength of monetary policy. It says the Phillips curve should be getting flatter over time. But then, like, this is a very contentious literature, so I don't want to like stick my neck out there and say this is like definitely what's going on in the data. I think of it as a thought experiment.
Great, awesome. Thanks so much, David. Perfect. So I'm going to go now with our last final paper. Let me try to share my screen. I hope you don't have Zoom fatigue yet. And just in case, I tried to make it as, wait, where did my slides go? Tried to make it as, have as many plots as possible. Great, so let me try to share my screen, and you let me know if you can see the slides or not. Let's see if it loads. Good? Oh, wait. Bring your shared screen to the front. All right, this is not supposed to happen. Let me try again. I can't believe this is happening after so many months already. I think this is it. Okay, let me try again. Okay, I think now it should work, and this should probably, if it doesn't move, let me know. Great. All right. I'm very excited to be able to share some recent work with you all. I should say that this is far more preliminary than the work that you've just seen in the previous 3 papers. So your feedback is very much welcome. The paper is called Disaggregated Economic Accounts, Measurement and Implications for Fiscal Policy, and it's joint work with Asger, Emil, and Kilian, who are in the room, and Niels, who couldn't join. So I'm going to just start with one of the first diagrams I ever saw in economics, and maybe you did too, namely the circular flow of money through an economy as sort of a visualization of national accounts. So we have, households at the bottom, they spend their money on firms. These firms then buy some intermediate goods from each other, pay profits, pay labor income back to households, and so sort of money circles through the economy. And over the last, few decades, and you could see some of that today, we've made quite a bit of progress in terms of disaggregating, the production side of the economy. Think of all the research that's been done on input-output networks. We've also seen quite a bit of work on trying to disaggregate the household side separately. Think of the work of Piketty, Size, Zuckman. Think of all the heterogeneous agent work that's been going on over the past few years. And what we'd like to do, and there's sort of a bit of a shared motivation there with Christina's paper, is we'd like to sort of jointly disaggregate both the household side and the firm side. And when you do that, obviously, there's a lot of new linkages that emerge. So think, for example, we want to get a sense on how, what kind of products specific households buy and where do they buy them, for example. So there's a rich set of networks that connect households and firms, and that's what we're going to try to measure in this project. So specifically, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to measure these links, these disaggregated accounts for Denmark. And we're going to do this by grouping firms and households into small region by sector cells. So how small is this? In our average household cell, we're going to have about 1,800 Danish adults. And then we're going to measure linkages between all the household cells and firm cells using administrative and bank transaction data. So with this measurement exercise, we're then going to use the linkages that we see in Denmark in the data and put them into a new Keynesian model that has many agents, regions, and sectors, and is sort of a mix of a bunch of different recent papers on this topic. And then we're going to explore implications for targeted fiscal policy. And we're going to find, and this is sort of our headline result here, we're going to find that in our model, transfer multipliers depend on the relative position of the household that receives the transfer to where the origin of the shock happened. So if you're sort of closer to where the shock hits in the economy, in the network sense, then the transfer multiplier is going to be greater. There's also forces there that echo exactly Christina's findings. I'm going to point them out as we go through the results. I'm not going to have time to talk about one of our applications. So we have an application to the Great Recession in Denmark, where we show that sort of optimally targeted policy that takes this targeting role into account achieves significant welfare gains relative to the actual policy that Denmark used during the Great Recession. All right, with that, I'm going to jump straight into the measurement exercise. So the level of analysis are going to be 2,400 region by sector cells in Denmark. So this is including 100 regions, the 99 municipalities, plus the rest of the world. There's going to be 10 retail sectors, such as food away from home. There's going to be 10 non-retail sectors, such as manufacturing. And there's going to be 4 non-working sectors, such as retired adults or students. And we're going to group into household cells all adults by the region of their residence and by the work sector. And we're going to group into firm cells the universe of all establishments by the region that they're located in and their production sector. And so this leaves, as I said in the beginning, this leaves us with an average household cell size of about 1,800 residents and an average firm cell that has about 130 establishments. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we then want to, get a sense of the linkages between the different household cells and between the different firm cells, and especially these cross linkages between households and firms. And sort of, I think our main novel set of linkages that we can measure directly are the linkages in the consumer spending network, by which we're going to mean the distribution of a household cell spending across all firm cells in the economy. We're also going to measure the input-output network, a bit like what Christina has done. We're also going to measure the labor supply network that's going to give us where on average $1 earned in a given firm cell is going across household cells. And we're also going to measure a profit network that very similarly gives you the destination of an average dollar of profits earned in a firm cell. Now, we also measure a bunch of other objects to sort of, with the goal in mind that at the end we can actually, match the national accounting aggregates, and then it has to have sort of a, coherent disaggregated system of national accounts. So, for example, we also measure exports and imports by firm cell. We measure things like taxes and transfers by household cell, and we also estimate MPCs by household cell. But I'm not going to give you sort of the details. We follow an existing paper that has done that in Denmark. So let me tell you how we measure the consumer spending network as sort of the main empirical contribution. So we use data from the universe of customer to firm transactions from Danske Bank. So Danske Bank is the largest Danish retail bank. It covers about 20% of the Danish adult population. And we see all credit, debit card transactions, all bill payments, direct debits, and mobile payments. And we use as a sample all adults that have their main account at Danske Bank and make at least one transaction in 2018 and 2019. We've made numerous checks to ensure that this data is representative. This just shows you a time series plot, but we're right now in the process of matching all the national accounting aggregates so that this really adds up to what we see in national accounts. Now, how do we use this transaction data to create these links between household cells and firm cells? And so what we're doing here is what's nice about the data is we observe the address and the sector directly for most transactions. And so this allows us to pinpoint exactly which establishment a given customer is shopping at. And then we assign that to the a corresponding firm cell. Now, for some transactions, we don't see the address, but only the sector. And for those, we impute it based on similar transactions, for example, transactions that occur in the same sector. And with that, we then aggregate by household cell. So we then look at where what customers in a given household cell are spending on across firm cells, and that gives us a distribution for every household cell across all firm cells in the economy in terms of how much, on average, they're spending of their money in that firm cell. There's two caveats to this measurement. First, some locations are actually not the locations where, some locations that we see where, a specific transaction is booked are not the location where the good or service is actually consumed. So for example, if you buy a movie ticket online, that might be booked at sort of the headquarters of the movie ticket, AMC or whatever company in New York, in this case in Copenhagen, but it might not be booked at the location where you actually go and see the movie. And so for those sectors, we reallocate the spending to where you usually go and see your movies rather than to send that money to the headquarters. And the second caveat is obviously we don't see where cash is going. We see cash withdrawals. We know that's about 9% of overall spending. And so for that, we just have to make the simplifying assumption that this is going where every other spending is going. So this is our consumer spending network. Now, what does this look like? Just two simple plots. Here on the left, you see spending of a particular household cell. In this case, I picked manufacturing workers in Copenhagen. You see Denmark. I don't know how familiar you are with the Danish geography. So this is the main island, Zealand. In Copenhagen, it's this red dot over here. So this is where they live. So clearly they spend the most where they actually live. And then you see that there's sort of a broad, gravity consistent a decay with distance to Copenhagen. But it's not all just gravity. And there's a few sort of brighter spots over here that some of which correspond to bigger cities, which would be expected, but some of which don't. Overall, if you average across all household cells, you see that it's broadly in line with a gravity relationship. This is for its different kinds of goods. And you see that, the gravity coefficient depends a bit on what kind of good is being looked at. Okay, great. So this is a consumer spending network. Now, how do we measure the other three networks? I'm going to just go a bit more quickly over this. The labor supply network, thanks to the administrative data that we have in Denmark, is extremely simple and precise to precisely measured. Because we see where every Danish adult works, we see where they live, and we see how much they earn. And so that allows us to give to infer a distribution of where the average dollar of labor earnings, made in a given firm cell is going across household cells. For the input-output network, what we do is we combine the sectoral input-output matrix that we see at the national level with regional production shares, so we know where production is located. And we combine that with a gravity coefficient that we estimate based on regional goods trade, and that allows us to get sort of a regionalized version of the input-output matrix. And finally, the profit network. Here again, we make use of the richness of the administrative level data. So, for example, profits of listed firms are assigned in line with administrative data on where which households own how much in the stock market. And profits of unlisted firms, think of your neighborhood mom and pop shop, we assign them in line with the location of where their employees work. Okay, so thinking that maybe the owners of those shops live in similar places, and that gives us a distribution for these profits of unlisted firms. So overall, this gives us a profit network. Just two simple examples for what the labor supply and the input-output network look like. Again, here on the left, I focus on the manufacturing industry in Copenhagen. Now, this time, this is the labor supply network, so meaning the distribution of labor supply to that industry. And you see that these are the locations where workers in that industry are sort of living, and you see that this is relatively highly, highly localized around where the industry is, because most of them have to commute to work. And so this, most of these people live in Zealand, in this main island here. On the right, you see that the input-output network is much less centralized. It's much broader because the gravity coefficient for that is smaller. And so, inputs used in the manufacturing industry in Copenhagen are sourced from all over Denmark. I should say here, we also allow for, imports, so that some of that will also come from abroad. Great. So now what I would like to show you is how we then make sense and connect these different networks into a single New Keynesian model. And that model then we can study to think about questions like targeted fiscal policy. So what's this model? It's going to be a deterministic infinite horizon small open economy model. It's going to run in discrete time. We're going to note household cells by I and firm cells by J. And one particular sort of large household cell is going to be the rest of the world. And one particular firm cell R is going to be a firm, the firms in the rest of the world with which trade is allowed. Now, the way this model will operate is that the shock, as well as all the adjustments, would happen at date 0. After date 0, we're going to be back in the steady state. And this is a trick that I've used in previous work, that David has used in previous work, that makes sort of things very tractable and sort of contained to just one period to get most of the intuition in a tractable set. Now, within household cells, we have a continuum of households in this model, a fraction of which are going to be hand to mouth. We're going to call that fraction mu I, and the others are going to be unconstrained. So we're going to have that's the remaining 1 minus mu I households. Both groups of households are going to maximize the same utility function. This utility function is a Cobb-Douglas utility, where the Cobb-Douglas weights are going to be just essentially being given by the spending network across firm cells. We also allow for a preference shifter delta that can sort of microfound a demand shock in this economy. We assume that they all have a firm cell specific labor endowment, lambda, and that's going to be given by the labor supply network that tells us, to which firm cells these households are supplying their labor. This can be potentially rationed, as I explained in a second, when there is too little demand for a given firm cell's products. I'm not going to walk you through exactly the budget constraint here, but let me just highlight that profits are sort of flowing into the budget constraint here in line with the profit network. And we're also allowing for transfers from the government to those households. Now, what happens, how are firm cells structured here? Firm cells are relatively simple. We just assume that there's a Cobb-Douglas production function, it's a labor shared gamma n, capital shared gamma k, and an intermediate input shared gamma x. And within intermediate inputs, omega is going to be the input-output network, and that's going to tell us sort of where intermediate goods are being sourced from for any given firm cell J. Capital here is predetermined at date 0, so it's not going to move around, but returns to capital are going to potentially move around in response to the shock, and the returns to capital are distributed as profits through the profit network. Great, so I'm going to assume here flexible prices and a downward nominal wage rigidity at date 0. So we're going to assume that wages can move upward at date 0, but cannot move downward. And if there is too little demand then for a sector, what will happen is that instead of wages going down, their labor demand, this firm cell's labor demand will go down. And so labor supply to this firm will be rationed by sort of a uniform factor Nj. Okay, so there's sort of an asymmetry there, whether a firm cell has a positive or a negative shock will make a difference for whether this firm cell's workers have unemployment or not. Great. In terms of the shocks and policies, so as I mentioned already, we allow for a preference shock that's potentially household cell specific, delta I. If I is the rest of the world, this would be an export demand shock. If I is a domestic cell, then this is a domestic spending shock. I also mentioned that we're allowing for transfers paid to household cells. These transfers are financed by a deficit at date 0 and paid back through sort of a uniform tax after date 0. And sort of the key way to get tractability here is to assume that the discount factor is very, very close to 1, in which case the taxes that have to be raised in the future to pay for the stimulus today approach 0, because the interest rate on government debt approaches 0. And this is sort of a trick that Mike Woodford has, for example, used in recent work. Great. So this gives us a model that has a rich set of household cells, rich set of firm cells that are connected through these 4 different networks. And what's kind of fun is that because we have data for all these, I can actually show you what this network looks like sort of visually. So let me go there now. So this is what the actual sort of Danish disaggregated network looks like, with all household cells and all firm cells represented as nodes. And all these lines are sort of the transaction between household cells and firm cells. Now the colors are different regions, and this was plotted using an algorithm that sort of co-locates nodes that have lots of transactions with each other. And you see that broadly, colored nodes are sort of in similar spaces, which shows you that a lot of interaction happens sort of at the regional level. And what's also kind of fun is that this algorithm actually spit out something that kind of resembles the geography of Denmark quite a bit. So on the right here, we have the main island where Copenhagen was. On the left, we have more, the less densely populated continental part of Denmark. So it's kind of fun that geography gets picked up. It's not all geography. So this bubble in the middle, for example, is the airport in Copenhagen, which you see that a lot of people from different parts of the country spend their money on. And that's why this shows up as sort of a central node in this diagram. All right, now how do we analyze the impact of shocks here? So there's a key distinction in our model between analyzing what happens for nominal output and analyzing what happens for real output. And the reason is that real output requires, that that actually you have unemployment in specific firm cells, whereas nominal output is independent of whether there's unemployment or not. It just could also increase, for example, when you have an increase in the wage or in the price. So for nominal output, because of all the Cobb-Douglas assumptions, it's very easy to pin down. So if I denote by delta y, the change in nominal output at day 0 relative to the steady state, we have a simple Keynesian cross-like equation. It's kind of similar to the one Christina showed, where you have sort of a direct effect that gives us sort of the first round effect on aggregate demand across all sectors. And then we have a multiplier term, just like in the standard Keynesian cross, there's a multiplier term where this would be MPC. The key distinction here is relative to the standard Keynesian cross that this is sort of all in vector space, where we stack all the sectors into a vector, and so delta y gives you the entire a vector of responses across all sectors, and M would be sort of an MPC matrix rather than a simple MPC object. And I can show you in sort of our network how shocks would propagate in line with this expression. So for example, if these blue dots are households that decide to spend less, you'd see that, okay, well, which sectors are which firm cells are affected by that? Well, the ones that they spend on, so that would be the orange dots here, and then they themselves, with the higher rounds of the Keynesian cross, they would then themselves pay their workers less, demand less from other firms, et cetera. And so you get sort of that the shock spreads through the economy. Now, the crucial thing I want to highlight here as sort of the main finding is what happens when you look at the real side, specifically when you look at the real effects of fiscal policy. So imagine we have a negative shock, like just the one I just showed you, that causes unemployment in some firm cells. And imagine not all firm cells have unemployment, meaning have rationing. So let me denote by phi the indicator function that tells us whether a firm cell is sort of in the rationing, in sort of the rationing regime where they have too little demand and positive unemployment. And phi equals 0 would correspond to a case where that a firm cell has just enough demand or too much demand even, in which case an increase in demand for that sector would only be reflected in an increase in prices rather than in a reduction in unemployment. And sort of the key result here is that transfer multipliers across all sectors, so this is a vector here, are given by this following expression, which crucially depends on what phi is, what the structure is of unemployment across firm cells. Now, it's not the only thing that matters, and some of the things that Christina and David have emphasized in their previous work actually show up here. So for example, high MPCs show up here. We have the labor share shows up here, like in David's recent work. But what we want to emphasize, what also shows up here is the sort of locations of which sectors are the ones that have positive unemployment. And so, and this expression then suggests that if you give money to households that have a high share of spending on sectors that have relatively high unemployment, that increases the real transfer multiplier. Great. I'm just gonna end with the following few plots. So just in a simple example, if these blue dots are the firm cells that have positive unemployment, which household cells are the ones that have a high multiplier across all household cells, and you see that it's mostly ones that are sort of relatively closely co-located with the firm cells that have positive unemployment. It's not just those, and it's not all of them that are co-located. So there's these other effects that play into the analysis as well, but you see broadly in line, there's sort of a role for targeting fiscal policy to the regions that are mostly affected. Great. I'm also way over time. Thanks so much for coming to the entire session and for sticking around. I'd be super happy to chat more about this research now. Thank you.
I have just an accounting question, actually. For the firms, you have like a bunch of establishment, but how do you deal with the establishments that are in different regions that may be part of like one big conglomerate firm in terms of the network and the accounting?
Right. So that is, I think, a super interesting question, one that we hope to address maybe in future work. I think it's really interesting to think about, how, say, a given increase in demand for a specific, establishment that's part of a larger firm, how that maybe propagates, through across firms, within the firm, across establishments. Right now, we make the assumption that they sort of are their own independent establishments. Now, we allow them to trade in line with the input-output network that's defined sort of at the level of establishments with other establishments of the same firm. But there's no sort of distinction between, being two establishments of the same firm that are in different locations versus two establishments of different firms that are in different locations.
I see. Okay.
Ludwig, can I also ask a clarifying question if you have time?
Yes, yes.
So one thing, what I think with the main result you showed us, there was this vector phi, which you mentioned it's an indicator function.
Yeah.
So how is it that the intensity of by how much the rationing is happening does not matter? Is it just a binary thing whether it binds or not, or how far you are from the binding, or how much its binding should matter as well? I would have thought.
Yeah, so this depends on how you do the rationing. So our rationing is sort of a 0-1 thing, right? If there's more demand than you had in the steady state, you're going to be in a world where everybody has a job and only the wages bid up. But if you're just slightly below that, you're going to be in a world where the wage is completely fixed and it's all going to go into quantities. You could define sort of a smooth rationing function. We've played around with that. And in that case, exactly as you intuit it, the phi would become sort of a thing between 0 and 1, and you would have sort of different weights that are not just binary.
Thanks.
Hi, Ludwig. I had 2 questions.
Yeah.
First, in your real effects results, what role are wage adjustments playing? I didn't see any like complicated elasticity of substitution stuff coming in, and I'm wondering if that's about Cobb-Douglas or something else. And then on the empirical side, how do you think about spillovers that might leave Denmark and then come back. I'm just thinking it's a country with like exports and imports around half of GDP. So I wonder if that might be important.
Yeah, two excellent questions. So on the first, so that's exactly right. So Cobb Douglas is exactly what sort of, keeps some tractability here. If we didn't have Cobb Douglas, it would be much harder to analyze, because then sort of the nominal flows would not be independently determined of what happens to prices. And so that's why, Cobb Douglas buys us a lot here. And on the second, that's fascinating. I mean, we'd love to have sort of more data beyond Denmark. Right now, this is sort of the best we can do. I don't know quantitatively, how large that would be, but certainly interesting to think about in future work. Great. Well, it's 2:15 Eastern, so I'm just gonna call it here, but I'm gonna stick around if you want to chat more about any of the papers. Just stick around as well. And let me just thank the presenters once more. And thanks so much for everybody, to everybody for coming.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Ludwig, for organizing. It was really
Yeah,
fun.
thanks for
I
organizing.
unfortunately have to run. I wish I could stick around, but I have to go. But thanks a lot. It was really good to see you guys. I wish we could have done it in person.
Yeah.
I agree.
Hopefully next time.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.